Picture this. April of 1815. On a remote island in what is now Indonesia, Mount Tambora had been rumbling for weeks. The local population grew nervous, but they had no idea what was coming. Then, on April 10, the mountain exploded with a force so immense that it remains, to this day, the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The explosion was heard over 1,000 miles away. People in Sumatra thought they were hearing cannon fire from a distant battle. The blast was so powerful that it literally blew the top off the mountain, reducing its height by over 4,000 feet. In an instant, entire villages simply ceased to exist. Pyroclastic flows, those terrifying avalanches of superheated gas and rock, raced down the mountainside at hundreds of miles per hour. 100,000 people died almost immediately, most of them never knowing what hit them. But the real catastrophe was just beginning. The eruption launched an absolutely staggering amount of material into the atmosphere. We're talking about 24 cubic miles of rock, ash, and debris shot straight up into the sky. To put that in perspective, that's enough material to bury the entire state of Rhode Island under 30 feet of volcanic debris. The finest particles, the ones that matter most, climbed into the stratosphere where they would circle the globe for months, then years. Within weeks, this ash cloud had spread across the entire planet. The particles reflected sunlight back into space before it could warm the Earth's surface. It was like someone had installed a giant, dirty filter over the sun. And as 1815 turned into 1816, the world began to realize that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. Spring arrived late in the northern hemisphere. Farmers planted their crops as usual, but the warmth they depended on never came. The temperatures remained stubbornly cold. And then came summer, except summer didn't really come at all. This is why 1816 became known as the year without a summer. In June, snow fell across New England. Not just a light dusting, but real, accumulating snow. In Vermont, in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, people woke up to find their world covered in white. Imagine that. It's June, the month when you should be watching your crops grow tall and green, and instead you're looking at snowdrifts. Frost killed crops throughout the northeastern United States. Farmers replanted, desperately hoping for better conditions, only to watch those crops freeze again in July. Some farmers tried 3, even 4 times to get crops to take root, each time watching their efforts destroyed by unseasonable cold. Across the Atlantic, Europe faced the same nightmare. Britain shivered through what felt like an endless winter. The Thames Valley, normally temperate and productive, became a frozen wasteland. France, still recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, saw temperatures plummet. Germany recorded frost in every single month of the year. Rivers that normally flowed freely froze solid in the middle of summer. People ice skated in July. It would have been amusing if it weren't so terrifying. The crops failed everywhere. Wheat, corn, oats, potatoes, everything that people depended on to survive simply wouldn't grow. What did manage to sprout from the ground either froze in the fields or rotted from the constant cold rain that fell throughout that miserable year. The harvest of 1816 was a disaster of biblical proportions. In some regions, farmers reported losing 90% or more of their expected yields. Entire growing seasons were simply erased, as if they'd never happened. And when the food ran out, the horror truly began. Famine spread across Europe and North America like a plague. Food prices didn't just rise, they exploded. In some places, the cost of basic staples increased by 1,000%. 1,000%. Grain that had been affordable to working families suddenly cost more than most people earned in a month. The wealthy, those who had the means, hoarded whatever food they could get their hands on. They built up reserves while their neighbors starved. Markets became scenes of desperation, with people fighting over scraps that would have been considered unfit for consumption in normal times. The poor had no such luxury. They ate whatever they could find. Tree bark was stripped and boiled into a kind of bitter soup. People foraged for roots, for weeds, for anything that might have a single calorie in it. Horses, those valuable working animals that families depended on, were slaughtered for meat. When the horses were gone, people turned to cats and dogs. When those were gone, things got even darker. There are documented accounts of people eating leather, boiling it for hours to make it soft enough to chew. In Switzerland, the situation became so desperate that the government declared a national emergency. Hungry crowds roamed the streets of Swiss cities, demanding food that simply didn't exist. Across France, where memories of revolution were still fresh, bread riots erupted in city after city. Bakeries were stormed. Grain stores were ransacked. The authorities tried to maintain order, but how do you control a population that's literally starving to death? In some cities, the military was called in to guard food supplies, creating a surreal situation where armed soldiers stood between starving citizens and warehouses full of grain that they couldn't afford to buy. The famine triggered mass migration on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Thousands upon thousands of people abandoned their homes, their farms, their ancestral villages. They moved in desperate waves, searching for anywhere that might have food. In Ireland, the suffering was particularly acute, a grim preview of the even worse potato famine that would strike 3 decades later. Germans fled to Russia. New Englanders packed up and moved west, abandoning their frozen farms for the uncertain promise of better land in Ohio and Indiana. Entire townships in Vermont and New Hampshire were effectively abandoned as populations fled westward. But you couldn't outrun the disaster because the disaster was everywhere. The ash cloud didn't respect borders or boundaries. It hung over the entire northern hemisphere, turning the sun into a dim, reddish disk that provided light but precious little warmth. People reported strange, beautiful sunsets, brilliant colors painted across the sky. They didn't understand they were watching their doom written in volcanic particles. Artists captured these unusual atmospheric effects in paintings, unknowingly documenting the visual signature of global catastrophe. Then came the diseases. Hunger weakens the body, makes it vulnerable. Typhus, that ancient killer, swept through malnourished populations. The disease thrived in the cramped, unsanitary conditions where desperate people huddled together. Thousands who had survived the famine succumbed to typhus. In some communities, the death toll from disease exceeded the deaths from starvation. Cholera outbreaks followed in the wake of typhus, spreading through contaminated water supplies. Medical facilities, already primitive by modern standards, were completely overwhelmed. Doctors had no effective treatments to offer. Here's what makes this catastrophe so fascinating from a historical perspective. Nobody understood what was happening. The science of climate didn't exist yet. People had no concept of how a volcanic eruption on a remote Indonesian island could affect weather patterns on the opposite side of the planet. They had no framework for understanding global climate systems or atmospheric circulation. Many thought they were witnessing divine punishment. Some believed the end times had arrived. Religious fervor intensified. Prophecies of doom circulated widely. Preachers drew enormous crowds with sermons about the apocalypse, and it's hard to blame people for believing them when the evidence seemed so overwhelming. The reality was far different, though no less apocalyptic. One mountain, in one massive explosion, had changed the chemistry of the atmosphere enough to disrupt weather patterns worldwide. It was a demonstration of just how interconnected our planet's systems are, and how vulnerable human civilization remains to natural forces beyond our control. The eruption had lowered global temperatures by about 3 degrees Fahrenheit on average, but in some regions, the drop was much more severe. That might not sound like much, but in agriculture, a few degrees can mean the difference between a successful harvest and total crop failure. But even in the darkest times, human creativity finds a way to express itself. That cold, dreary summer of 1816 produced some of the most famous works in literary history. Mary Shelley, just 18 years old, was staying at a villa in Switzerland with her future husband Percy Shelley and their friend Lord Byron. The weather was so miserable that they couldn't go outside. Trapped indoors day after day, with storms raging outside and the temperature frigid, Byron proposed a challenge. Each of them would write a ghost story. Mary Shelley's contribution to that dark summer became Frankenstein, one of the most influential novels ever written. The book's themes of unnatural creation, of science gone wrong, of humanity tampering with forces it doesn't understand, all of this emerged from those gloomy months when the sun barely shone and the world seemed to be dying. The novel's atmosphere, that sense of dread and isolation and cold, was ripped directly from the reality Shelley was living through. When you read Frankenstein's descriptions of desolate landscapes and unnatural cold, you're reading about 1816. Byron himself wrote a poem called Darkness, a haunting vision of the end of the world. It describes a dying sun, a frozen earth, humanity's desperate struggle to survive as civilization collapses. I had a dream, which was not all a dream, it begins. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. He was describing what he saw around him, a world where the sun had effectively been extinguished by a veil of volcanic ash. The poem goes on to describe people burning everything they could find for warmth, civilization breaking down, humanity reverting to primal survival instincts. The year without a summer eventually ended. The ash particles gradually settled out of the atmosphere. 1817 brought better weather. Harvests improved. Slowly, painfully, the world recovered. But the scars remained. Entire communities had been depopulated. Economic disruption lasted for years. The social and political upheaval contributed to unrest that would shape the coming decades. Some historians argue that the hardships of 1816 contributed to revolutionary movements that swept across Europe in the following years. This was the last great natural catastrophe before the modern age, before scientific understanding gave us the tools to comprehend such events. Today, we monitor volcanoes constantly. We understand how eruptions affect climate. We can model the spread of ash clouds and predict temperature changes. We have global food distribution systems that can respond to regional crop failures, though as recent events have shown, these systems remain vulnerable. But in 1816, humanity faced a global disaster with none of these advantages. They couldn't see it coming. They didn't understand what was happening while it occurred. And they had no idea when, or if, it would end. They simply endured, day after frozen day, month after frozen month, hoping that eventually the warmth would return. The psychological toll was immense. People who had lived their entire lives with the certainty of seasonal patterns suddenly found themselves in a world where the basic rules of nature seemed to have been suspended. The story of 1816 reminds us of something we often forget in our modern world of technology and comfort. We live on a dynamic, sometimes violent planet. The forces that shape our world, the volcanoes and earthquakes and storms, don't care about human civilization. They operate on their own timescales, following their own rules. We've built our entire society on the assumption of relatively stable climate and weather patterns. But that stability is more fragile than we like to admit. One volcano changed the world. One mountain, erupting for just a few days, created a catastrophe that killed hundreds of thousands and affected millions more. It rewrote history, triggered migrations, inspired literature, and demonstrated the awesome power of natural forces. The year without a summer stands as a stark reminder that we remain, despite all our advances, vulnerable to the planet we call home. And somewhere out there, another volcano is building pressure, preparing for its own moment in history.